And welcome to the Blackhouse, my internet access radio, 106.1 FM. You're in the studio today with Eddie, Leah, and Craig, and our special guest in today, Tammie Stroman. How's everyone's week been, guys? Like,
oh, really?
Really? Yeah, really.
Menopause. I hate it. It's never ending. It doesn't stop. What's going on? Everything. You do 100 million things and nothing gets done. That's what my life is, basically. And everybody looks at you like, what are you doing? I'm like, everything. Can't you tell? It's everything. No, it's been all right. It's been a good week. I'm missing out on all the things I want to do, which is like boogie boarding and stuff like that, fun things. But yeah.
That's feeling like the end of summer. It feels like the summer's come to an end.
No, don't say that. I didn't get enough days in. Don't say that, Eddie.
I feel like boogie boarding, like, as long as you got a wetsuit, like, you can, like, I've gone boogie boarding in winter before.
Yeah,
like.
Apparently June's the best season in Wellington. It's like, there's just like 100 million things to do. And then when I want to do something, I've run out of day, you know? But hey, give a shout out for this, what is it? Living Collage.
Oh, just the ethnic Rainbow Alliance.
Rainbow Ethnic Alliance and Michelle Mascol. They're down at the waterfront right now at Odlands. What is it? Odlands Square.
Plaza.
Yeah. They're down there.
What's that kind of looking like? What's it kind of?
Oh, I haven't been down. Like I've been doing everything, Eddie.
But I was gonna say, like, what's your impressions of what it's been, what it looks like? Is it just kind of a bit like this, like storytelling sort of thing, or just kind of like people's?
I'm not sure. It was really, I couldn't really tell from the thing, but like, you know, Michelle, I've been friends with Michelle, and you know Michelle too, right?
Yeah,
so, yeah, got to support, you know, Rainbow Ethnic Alliance, obviously supporting our LGBTQ community. So awesome. There should be more of that. Yeah. And our single mums that are in menopause as well. Like, how about that too? Yeah, that's life.
So I'll pass it over to you to introduce our guest for today.
Yes. Okay, so welcome, Tammie Stroman.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. And there's been all this stuff that you've been doing, and we've brought you in today because we had this really cool conversation with all the girls. You know, all the girls of African heritage that have lived here for like most of their lives. We're all sitting around, and you were telling us about the story of food.
Yes, we were.
Yeah.
While we were actually having food. So, first of all, kia ora, hello.
Do your intro. Yeah.
Yes, greetings and a big old what's up to you all. I feel really privileged to actually just be sitting here having this conversation. I heard this really cool quote to kind of kickstart us off, and it said, the best weapon is to sit down and talk.
Yep.
And that's attributed to Nelson Mandela. So I'm actually really happy to just be sitting here to have a conversation with you about food, about what food security means in the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the simple question that is quite complicated that you asked me, why is food so expensive in this country?
Because I've just discovered some things in Wellington that have really helped me out. And I know what it's like to have food insecurity for myself. I know what it's like for other people in our community and the shame that comes with food insecurity, but also needing it. And, you know, everybody needs food, like they need water. So I've grown up in an era where we probably had food security. I'm old enough to remember that food wasn't a struggle. And I don't think it was, or it might have been you actually, that said that we grow enough food in New Zealand to feed the population 10 times over or something. I don't know if that was the accurate thing, but copious amounts.
Yeah. I suppose the short story is that there actually is an abundance of kai here. So the story of food insecurity in our context is not about scarcity. It's mostly about social justice and economics. And so as the context of setting that discussion, it's a complex intersectional story. It's not just about food. It's about having access to that food and about whether or not we honor food systems that give people equitable access to that food. And, access can mean an abundance of different things. It can mean geography, where you're located, how you actually can access food. It can mean cultural appropriateness, whether or not the kai you have access to is good for you and what your preferences are and your autonomy around that. But most of the time when we discuss the word access in the food system space, it's usually economic and being able to afford access to not just food of your choice, which can be anything, but access to nutritionally adequate food. And so, that's the thread that I really like to talk about and to unpack a little bit about how we got to a nation where we have this loose thing that we throw around. And I've heard that ratio, and it was called the 2010 type thing. And looking into where that actually came from, the best we could find was sourced from a speech that John Key gave at an agriculture event. And we think. Yeah, okay. But what people were saying was that there's this 20-10 ratio, and that New Zealand grows and exports the equivalent of volume of food that could potentially feed 20 million people, the volume of food. Wow. And we export that out, and then we import the volume of kai for about 10 million. Yeah. Bearing in mind the responsible narrative within that is that that's not across all the food demographics. Right, okay. So it's just kind of weight numbers, but it gives you an indication that what it suggests is that in a country where we actually have access to the volume of kai that could potentially feed 10 million people, why do we have a growing disparity of people experiencing food insecurity in a country of 5 million? We should be able to theoretically feed our population twice over on the imports and exports that we've got. Yep. But we have a growing population. The number of people experiencing food insecurity is a little bit ambiguous because part of the data journey is that. Yeah. We're only just having these conversations about how do we measure food security and things like that, even though there's been many pioneers for years now, decades since the 1980s, who've been having this discussion about food insecurity, because that's when we first started to see formalized food banks pop up in New Zealand.
Yeah, I actually remember when they first popped up in the early 90s.
Yeah, look, we moved to Aotearoa in the late 80s, and I remember during that time we went down to White House Road in Te Tai Bay in Porirua. Shout out to that rohi. We went down and we went to Mr. Joe's fruit and veg place. We then went to Climo's Butchers to go and get our meat. The supermarket was probably the last place that we went to. Yeah. Whereas we find ourselves in a situation, fast forward now to 2025, we have a broken food system that's heavily reliant on a duopoly for pretty much the entire access to food that we can get and buy. And they certainly have a sizable market share. And so when you have a duopoly that controls the majority of where we get our food, then you have a competitive problem. And so, so there's conversations around the economics of that and what that implies. And then, of course, there's an actual social justice story. So what we value as a nation to ensure that all of our people are whole. We kind of maneuver within this capitalist culture. Yeah. And, at the same time, we've maneuvered in a more responsible one where we're contemplating and we're trying to help achieve sustainable development goals, which had a 2030 target. 5 years away, people. We're nowhere near achieving that. Yeah. So the space that I usually speak on is SDG, or Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which is zero hunger. And the social justice side is that we treat our kai, our food, as a commodity and not as a basic human right. And so, all of those pretenses are part of the threads that intersect into why we have such expensive food and why we have a growing population of people that experience food insecurity.
So what's been, I guess, thinking of pulling back, and obviously with Leah bringing up the point of that food insecurity, from your recollection, not really being a thing for you growing
No,
up.
no.
What's been the kind of journey that actually got us to this point? Because I have my suspicions based on the rough time periods, based on stuff that's happened kind of elsewhere in the world, but I can kind of see, like, in terms of, I'd say, like, I could make comparisons to like Reagan's US, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, like that particular time period of neoliberalization within economic systems.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, from your view, what's been the kind of actually journey that's actually got us to this food insecure point,
Right.
and how has it kind of been shaped by, like, obviously our food production industries, like what we actually export out, where you export a lot of meat products, a lot of dairy products. How has that kind of shifted over time to the point where now obviously we export way more than we export, and we still produce what we should feed, like you said, feed a population of 10 million.
Yeah, and really great questions, and they're really meaty questions. And so, in fairness to the conversations, there's a lot of giants who delve a little bit deeper, but I can certainly address some of that and at least go on the peripheral and as an understanding for the trajectory and what got us here. So I suppose I was actually just in a forum with the Waikato Wellbeing Project Regional Food Shed Analysis, and they were going over a report which kind of breaks down fertility of land, what's grown locally, what's kept locally versus what goes elsewhere. And that was a really kind of key starting point for me with unpacking this part of the conversation. So I think if we mostly go back to the 1980s, when Aotearoa was coming out of a recession and Rogernomics, and we know that there was a major shift in where we were growing as a nation and what we were valuing. And so we went to this real framework of that markets will create all the solutions for all the problems that we're having. And so we started to see a lot more selling off and privatization of things. And then, of course, you've got global trading, and there were all sorts of movements. So New Zealand was going through an economic recession during that time of real big transition with how we were maneuvering as a government. And it was at that time, out of that economic recession, that formalized food banks started to become a thing. So up until that point, we had a lot of food here. We shared a lot of it. We had a lot of home kill. We had a lot of things like that, hunting and so forth, and all of that was shared. That's since become quite a highly regulated market, and Eat New Zealand and a woman called Angela Clifford does incredible work in terms of unpacking the farming side of things and what's gone on there with the changes and what the regulations that has dictated that and policy shifts.
And there was also that whole thing where back prior to the 80s, a lot of people had their quarter-acre sections, so they grew their own food, right?
Yeah, look, we can go right back. That farm that I had in Waikanae, we can literally go back to the 1850s, and we can talk about land pressures, fertile land accessibility, market competition, dismantling of other world views, and how that contributed to our food systems. We can literally go right back to the 1850s, really, and into that post-colonization phase. But I suppose, more in terms of a modernized sense of where we've shifted. I think it's just become the fact that we mostly value food as a commodity and not as a human right, and that we've got this duopoly who heavily controls the majority of our food. They have something staggering, like nearly 90%, something like that, late 80s of the market share. I mean, you've got other sources of kai, you've got community gardens, you've got food boxes, you've got takeaways and service industry who can do healthy food options for you even. But that's just a tiny fraction of where the majority of our food is sourced. And, that aspect of market share and dominance, it impacts everything from production to distribution to the growers and the farmers themselves, and exclusivity in order to get their products out and sold. That you have to covenants and different agreements, and and really importantly, land, whenua,
Yeah.
where competition can actually set up and, what is accessible. So yeah, there's some deeply complicated stories within that, but all of these things have had an impact and have created this catalyst for where we are today. And then of course, we start to see some of the vulnerabilities within our food systems and natural disasters. So, go to COVID. And
Right.
COVID was actually the real reason why I ended up getting heavily into food security. So I'd been into teaching and social work, where kai was a tool to battle truancy, to battle engagement, to get through some of those social deficiencies and barriers to even get young people into school. And then maintaining a role in attendance, we'd wrap food parcels around that. So by sharing your time, we would share our resources with you. So food became a tool. So and that was the whole time I taught and did social work for the Wellington City Mission. And so, the kai story is deeply embedded in policy and, just the ways in which we can maneuver and go forward and how it impacts on the wellness of our population and how people contribute.
Eddie, do you have something? Because I've got one.
No, go for it.
Okay, so what were you seeing when you were in the city mission about how food insecurity impacts different communities? What were you seeing out there?
Yeah.
Because I know what I'm seeing in our community.
Right.
But I'm wondering, other communities, how's that going?
Yeah, so look, there are tons and tons of community kai distributors and really big social service agencies who have stepped into that deficit gap. Bearing in mind that food banks weren't formally funded until the weren't formally formalized until the 1980s. But it was only during the COVID era and lockdown era where they actually officially funded. So that's the thing, they weren't even, you may have been able to pick up a regional contract, a service contract, but it wasn't a national funding. And it wasn't until we went on lockdown and we started to see lots of people were in isolation, so they couldn't actually physically get to a supermarket. So now you had community kai distributors needing to get that kai out. So there was a real shift in operations. Then in my instance, that movement was the catalyst for me becoming food insecure at one point. So I'd been doing teaching and social work, and then our program kind of went into an online version because we could no longer meet in person, and it downsized what staff were needed to be wrapped around that. And then, of course, the City Mission made some shifts in what they were owning as a response to community need, and housing was coming up as being quite important. And at that time, people needed to be housed when we were being isolated and locked down. And it meant the end of my job at the City Mission.
Right.
And so then a professional woman, university, qualified, I found myself at a point, a super vulnerable position, like, wow, how do I pay my mortgage now? And it was just through the grace of a very dear friend of mine at Kurihia Kai Zero Hunger Collective and the Po Arahi there, Trish Malcolm, that I was offered a role to tie me over, which then turned into a 3-year journey of and then going on to do other advisory pieces in this space. Yeah. So what we saw during COVID especially was how vulnerable our food systems are. It only takes one one incident, and it could really throw and put a lot of people in compromise positions. We also saw the demand it put on food banks. I mean, I had first-hand anecdotal and true data from food banks who were giving us their numbers at Kurihia Kai at the time where I was working, and telling us how their operations had increased. So you see seasonal influxes, Christmas time, things like that. You can expect to give out more food parcels. But what we saw during COVID was, in some instances, people were doubling their kai distribution, and in some instances quadrupling, 4 times the amount. Now that was at peak. When it started to deflate and come back down, when things were back open and we were getting a little bit more normalized, it never came back to the original levels that we were operating at, and it's continued to grow up.
Yeah.
What we also saw at these food banks and what was going on at these community kai distributors is how indiscriminate food insecurity can be.
Yeah.
You know, we know data tells us that it particularly affects Māori and Pacifica women. It specifically impacts on single parents. We saw during COVID a massive rise in single men, that it was in the disability community is in that. Yeah, but it became more and more indiscriminate. And even in this climate now, where we have like 4-point-something% of unemployment, you know, I heard a story the other day. Tori Whānau literally talked about it on LinkedIn, where you know, a person was feeling disheartened, having applied for 200 plus jobs, and getting interviews, but it just not landing. And even our Wellington Mayor kind of has accepted that it's a tough market at the moment for work and employment. And so, of course, cost of living starts to kick in. Yeah, so, you know, all these things are intersectional threads when you have, and then natural disasters factor. So we saw East Coast floods and things like that. And, you know, when we were having, you know, just different natural disasters and anomalies wiping out our crops. And in that instances, it was creating scarcity. But as a whole, we do have enough food to feed our population. We just have barriers with getting people to it, whether or not they can't afford it. And usually cost is it. You know,
because I mean, in Māoridom, in Pacific culture, in even African American culture, food is like, that's how we show love to people, right?
Right.
Even in African culture, like people come to your house, you're supposed to feed them, right? And I think I had a conversation the other day with a young man, and he just said to me, you know, like, you need to let people know about this free supermarket. There's a free supermarket where you can get points. You've got, like, you're going to tell us about that, because there's a need out there. And when I was in this supermarket, it's run by Wellington City Mission, I think that's right, Whakamaru, I was there. I said, how many African people or people of African heritage actually access this? And they were like, oh, we don't really see many. We don't have much data on that. And I'm wondering whether there's, besides the shame of when you need something, you're in this country and you need something and you've migrated here, or I don't think if you've grown up here, you feel exactly the same way. But if you've migrated, like I remember being a migrant in Australia, I wasn't going to go into any help services or anything. I didn't, you know, I just have to keep slogging. But I'm wondering if that's also part of the barriers, the cultural barriers as well, you know?
Yeah, look, I think that, and I can speak on it a little bit in terms of actual tangible data. So there's just not an abundance of it around, people who draw on those stats. And so that's part of it. But then I also think that there's a silo aspect of that, because migrant communities, particularly the Black communities here that come, tend to kind of be in their pockets of people and communities. And although we're all sort of lumped in this mass kind of labeling, census labeling as Black or African, you know, these communities can function quite different and within and for themselves. And so I think there's a lot of people that, or communities, particularly in the Black diaspora, who are sorting out their own or working with their own, and we just don't know what the wider conversation of that may be. Also, the migrant families that I work with, particularly the Black families, there was a level of like, they accepted support from us because we had young people in our role and we built a relationship with them, and you know, slowly but surely got there, and they let us in and they let us offer some help. But most of the stuff we were giving them was really culturally inappropriate. They couldn't consume it or eat it, or you know, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't made in, for their preferences or for their belief systems and so forth. And so, yeah, there's definitely a conversation around our the wider community not so much falling on the radars. And like I said, I've been in many forums where There's been a Te Ao Māori lens. There's more and more, we're starting to see more of a Pacifica lens come in. Places like Kurihia Kai have now got a pro-Pacifica that's specifically in charge at looking at how we support food insecurity and strengthen food security within that community. But yeah, I've yet to see anyone specifically go in and speak on behalf of a Black community. And I think it's because we just don't know. So, we're a small population here, but, we've been here way prior to, this wave of
in the 90s.
modernized 90s migration. And we literally had a Black American mayor in the 1800s, of the borough of Onslow. So Kandala area. So, and we know that there were Black people that were part of the whaling stations and
gold mining.
Yeah, so there's actually been, albeit however small, a percentage of Black people here. I just don't know that we know how to have the right conversations about that, or if we could, or that we've even specifically got access to that data if we were, because I know when I fill out forms, I'm usually another. There may be an African box, but I'm African American. And so I wasn't born in the motherland on the continent. I was born in the US. So do I tick Africa or do I tick other? And yet I see myself directly as part of the Black diaspora. But I'm not recognized even on that census as that. And so, it's even if we were to collect that data, would it really break down which parts of our community are struggling or need strengthening the most? I don't know what it would. So the data story is absolutely part of it. I think that's where communities know and can contribute to their solutions the best. And this is where I directly see platforms like the Blackhouse and being able to have more exposure within communities that are targeted for our people to be able to have these conversations and to exclude the barriers and shame of that. Many migrant families are already under the belief that they feel there's a sense of obligation to not so much pay back, but to not take more because they've already been invited or allowed into this country under circumstances where they couldn't be in their own countries. And so having to add on top of that, there's a shame level of that. One of those expressions, as an example, like even in Pacific Island community, how that comes out, we know that there was a truancy issue in education that was directly linked to poverty-related food insecurity. Because Pacific Island ainga, their families were needing to take young people out of school to go and work and to contribute to the household just to actually alleviate some of that food insecurity. And so there was a direct link to truancy and poverty-related hunger for Pacific Islander communities. And so, it'd be interesting to see what are our links? Where do we sit in that conversation specifically?
You see, you don't see similar things to that, but you do see this alignment with having your children stay at home much, much, much longer because the head of the household might be a single mum in our community, and they may not be able to get into the work that they maybe be able to do, get paid for what they're able to do. And so like you have these big families living together, which to me makes perfect sense, but it's also directly related to the cost of living and everything else,
Oh yeah, 1,000%.
Insecurity and
well, a survey that was released by the Auckland City Mission, it was a few years back now, like in 2020, I want to say, so maybe 4 or 5 years ago or so. They found that 80% of people who experience food insecurity said it was due to cost of living and exceeding their income. So, again, that's was most likely a test poll at a Tammie Stroman, because that came out of Auckland City Mission. Helen Robinson, who was the author of that report. I don't know how that would be reflected down here, but I would say that we're pretty much in alignment. We have a country, aside from population density, which is probably why Tammie Stroman tends to present more with the problem. But look, we essentially have a government that has predominantly focused on an exporting market and not so much nurturing localized circular economies.
Yeah.
Although what was interesting that came out of that Waikato food share report was that there's this kind of belief that if there's more localized growing, that the cost will go down for those local people. And so we talk a lot about growing localized and circular economies. Although what was pointed out with that is actually there's some discrepancy with that, because just because it's grown locally doesn't necessarily mean those locals are going to get it cheaper. Because once it's grown, it's given to other people to sell and distribute and so forth.
It also makes sense, the idea of like, obviously if you're working within a local level, like I've seen someone talk about, well, obviously sometimes things cost more because obviously you need to compensate people for the labor they're actually doing producing that food, right? Like that's part of the problem of a duopoly, is like, obviously that's expensive, but also comparatively, because they have a monopoly on a duopoly on everything, like they still control what would in some ways be in theory be the cheapest price, right? Versus if you're a localized grower, to remain consistent, and even if you're trying to remain above water, essentially, like possibly the need to actually charge more because you need to be able to actually like continually reinvest that money back into your own business, right?
Yeah, I mean the misconception that localizing food production will make it cheaper for supply is a misconception.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly because of that. I think the better way to say it is that reducing farm to table and accessing localized supply is
So cutting out the middle people.
yeah, that essentially that's what it is. And there's been many good legends before me who have said exactly that. If you can reduce the farm to table, one of the problems with that is supply.
Right.
So, the duopoly does have the biggest supply chain. And so, it makes sense that people want to supply them. But then there are agreements behind the scenes in terms of exclusivity of who you can give your product to.
Right.
And so even if you say we're to have an abundant season and you meet your obligations for supply with one of the bigger chains, your excess still could not be sold at markets and things like that because you're in exclusivity agreements. So this is partly why when we started to see the pricing inflation during COVID, why was everything like going up? Like why? And I really don't believe it was a shortage or we couldn't get it. There were some limitations around. There were some limitations, but the reality is that it kick-started exactly why the Commerce Commission decided to do an inquiry into retail and the supermarket chains itself, and investigate what was going on. And it was an interesting read. So I encourage people to actually even go back and to read that.
Oh,
because
definitely send us some links we can put up.
Yeah, there was some key findings out of that and recommendations. And I mean, obviously growing, competition would one. And I mean, and I've yet to see major growth in that area in terms of competition being opened up. There was talks even about the behavior of some of our food supply in terms of using loyalty cards and confusing things like that, because 90% of us, I'm making that number up, but the majority of us would go and swipe our loyalty cards to get that couple cents off that. And whilst it creates some savings for us, it actually is more valuable for the traders to know who's shopping, when, what they're buying. And so these loyalty incentive cards, I use them myself.
It's more for the data that it generates, as opposed to like
I'd probably start short of me personally saying that because of the spaces I still want to be invited into. But I do think that, but that's a known feature of these loyalty cards and things of those incentives. And we know that there's a whole science around where product placement is in supermarkets. And we know that some supermarkets own certain brands, and Pam's is a well-known example of that. And so even though a lot of people, for budgeting reasons, will grab that lower cost end in actual fact, if one of the supermarket owns that brand, like
So that's them just making it cheaper.
Yeah,
because
so
they can.
like I think there's just some wider conversations to have around the practice of that, and I think I haven't forgotten, but I actually encourage people use the systems like the Official Information Act, based off the Commerce Commission's inquiry into practice and the recommendations that were made on what needed to change to have a healthier, a more robust food system in terms of that aspect of it. I don't know that many of those have actually been achieved.
Right.
And I was personally following it for a while there, but it gets a little taxing when you know what part of the solutions are, but we're still,
Tell us the story about eggs and why eggs are so expensive. Are you able to do that? Are we allowed to do that?
Yeah, look, again, I think we're generally, let's not forget that Aotearoa is actually in a recession. So I think in general, supply and demand and just in terms of our economics as a nation and the health of our nation is suffering.
Right.
So yeah, but it doesn't help when pricing indexes aren't, we as community don't really have any say of that. So yeah, it's a good question. I'm probably not the most equipped to answer it, but yeah, I venture to say it has a lot to do with what we've been discussing in terms of who controls market, access, supply, and people kind of being able to set the bar, And I keep speaking on the duopoly because before I even came here, I had a look and I read last year's analysis and report, like literally billions of dollars of profit are being made. Yet, we have identified in Aotearoa that we have a minimum wage, which many are compliant, including the duopoly, but that does not equal a livable wage, which sits above that. So my basic question is, and for places that are reporting masses of money of profit for the elite that may sit at certain levels, how is that not filtered to us as the consumers, but then also the workers? Like, can we not pay livable wages at these places instead of minimum wage? People like Mind the Gap are doing really good advocacy around that. And there's economics in that. There was a campaign that came out last year for every like $1 that a Pākehā earns, everyone else sits below that. And at the bottom of that data of that graph, it happened to be Māori and Pacifica women ranging between late odd 70s and early 80 cents for every $1. But again, I had to question, where would our diaspora fit on that? Like, we know we have a lot of skilled migrants here, but it's not always transferable in terms of what they can contribute here. And so, there's stories of people in income brackets that are not necessarily justifiable to what they're capable of contributing. So there's some interesting threads, and again, you see the theme, how so much of it goes into a social justice spectrum, and telling that story. So I'm definitely at a phase, where I'm kai tui tui kōrero. I'm a weaver of these stories. I like to have these conversations. We talk about having 1,000 cups of teas, getting to know people. I really hope that this is an opportunity for people to understand a little bit more about our food systems and how they're broken.
And is there a bit of like just thinking, is there an, obviously talking about things centered in Auckland, obviously is there a bit of an urban rural divide within these sorts of things, within food insecurity as well? Like, is it that region or out in the regions or more rural areas experience more or less, like differing in different ways? Like, what's that kind of rural urban split?
No, that's a great question. And so that was part of another piece of research that I was part of, but I didn't lead it. But the research was about how do we realize food secure communities throughout the motu and throughout the country. And so the first step was to go out and see who was creating food secure communities how are they doing it?
Mm.
And could we share some of that wisdom? What was interesting was the lack of strategizing around that. So at the time, the researcher had scaled their country, and this included approaching regional councils and asking for their food security strategies or their plans. Most did not have them. So I think
is that because they focus on food insecurity?
Yeah, so we have predominantly sat in a narrative where we talked about food insecurity, and we talked about and so when you do that, you sit in a responsive mode. You know, it's instantly on response.
Yeah.
If you do that subtle shift of talking about food security, now you're on a trajectory that actually does look for solutions.
Right.
And so part of this public-facing discussion is, and we considered it once as a monitoring and an evaluation aspect of a food security strategy I was working on, was how much of the media coverage told the story from a food security lens and not from a food insecurity lens. So I think in answer to your question is there's a lot of localized solutions happening, but they're not necessarily coordinated efforts. You're starting to see more and more people in different regions do that within their rohi and in their regions, which is great, but that's not necessarily mimicked across the board. And then, of course, you have just part of that is the differing populations. Like I know that there's food banks down in Queensland, but they're quite different in terms of the people they service than up in Tamaki Makaurau,
Right.
up in Auckland. So geography plays a factor in how coordinated are. You do have tremendous efforts, those who coordinate that. So a good example of that would probably be, that I'm familiar with, is the Salvation Army. So they have a Te Kaimakona food security strategy, and kudos to them for actually having a strategy. And they have rolled that out nationally amongst all their community ministries, which is, right from the top of the north to the bottom of the south. And they're broken, well, historically they had been broken into 4 regions. And part of that was them building their community of practices and getting their regions talking more and moving towards capabilities building. So stop having people so reliant on receiving kai, because as well intended as food parcels are, they are a contributor and they perpetuate food insecurity, because in no way do they actually create food security. That's a really important distinguishment.
It's like a lifeline that gets you
Yeah,
temporarily out of a situation.
Thank you. And I love that you use the word temporary, because that is exactly what a food parcel is supposed to be. It's meant to be a temporary response to those who experience food insecurity. It's actually just become a dependency model now. And especially for those who have got ongoing poverty-related issues.
It's part of the issue, or not in an interesting way, like you're talking about obviously how, I guess, the rise of like food banks and that sort of thing over time is part of the issue that they are, by and large, like this aspect of the kind of, let's say, the social state of the welfare state has been shipped out to external entities. So the idea of like that these are being led by, Wellington City Mission, Salvation Army, it's not to disparage the work that they do, but part of the issue is that this isn't being tackled or being handled. And I was then talking about the difference in local governments or local councils or central government in actually addressing this. Like, as part of the issue is like, well, because you've shipped this out to external organizations that have generated fantastic amounts of research or information that have this kind of, that do have this data, but like you aren't as a government doing that yourself. And therefore you are in a position where you're behind the ball, struggling to kind of come up with these solutions or develop these strategies. Because you've that's kind of part of the system as well, of this kind of like neoliberalizing system, is that it is the withdrawal of central government from the welfare state.
You're absolutely, and again, that was partly what came out of the 80s and the shift when we went to market and we went privatized, and absolutely catalyst. The other part of that thread is that we actually don't have a national food security strategy from a national government level.
If there was one,
we have emergency response systems and things in place to temporarily, but we actually don't have a national framework. And there was a lot of people working to create one.
Right.
And actually, it's a good question. I don't know really, but it kind of got it's sort of stalled. And I think because so much of it has to be in alignment with what we value as a nation. And going right back to pretty much where I was leading, that one of the problems is that we treat food as a commodity and not as a basic human right. And so, yeah, that's a big part. And so, yeah, we don't have a national security strategy from the government. We have localized regional councils that sometimes do that, but not all.
Is this why home kills have become so regulated? Because everybody wants to get a cut of everything that comes from the hunter hunting to the end situation. Like everybody, because it feel like when I'm listening to you talk about it, it's almost like when I was working in the mines and everybody had to do their OH&S, but it wasn't to keep people safe. It was to stop mining getting litigated.
Right.
And it kind of feels a little bit like that why would they stop people being able to go out and, you know, kill a beast, bring it home, chop it up? Why have they added all this extra stuff on there so that...
Because that's always an interesting one for me. Sorry, just jump in. That's always an interesting one for me in terms of obviously New Zealand and predator or like pest-free strategies. And there's a sort of thing of like, well, we have an abundance of goats, we have an abundance of deer, we have an abundance of trout that are invasive species, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, is there a, like you said, probably feeding into that sort of like, is it the regulation around actually being able to, and obviously there is a degree where that's probably a good thing, but just because it is game, like wild game, but also it does seem interesting that like, you know, if I want to buy goat meat, I have to go to the Hull Butchers out in Newtown, or I have to go to More Wilson's.
Right.
And More Wilson's as like the elite.
Instead of just somebody like, you know, my brother on my mum's side's a hunter. He used to bring us meat all the time.
Yeah.
But then he'd stopped, but...
Yeah, no, there's definitely conversations that are exactly around that. So how do we make some of those things a bit more accessible again? Because they have become so highly regulated and a tough space to maneuver in. So yeah, there's definitely people doing their really, really hard work about reconnecting people back to those sources. Emily King has a really good read called Refood. And she talks about growing and making and nourishing and how do we traverse going back to abundance, but also to, you know, there's a conversation around what used to work.
Yeah.
And so if you start to look at some of our Indigenous Māori frameworks, and Dr. Jessica Hutchins is really good with leading some of those conversations with Hua Parakore, and a kaupapa Māori Indigenous system and framework for growing kai. And so I think taking on board other lenses is you know, because we have a capitalist system that tries to maximize on growth seasons and getting the most out of every season, whereas you have other frameworks that honor using the seasons to get not exploiting, you know, kind of growing in a way that complements the seasons rather than max what we can get from them. And so in a way that's regenerative, and sustainable. So yeah, so I think that there's been a loss of the contribution, and part of that came up with this treaty principle bill and how we honor our partnership as because there were some powerful submissions again by many iwi organizations in terms of how that just generally breaches the treaty and, you know, our basic human rights and the contracts that we've even signed up to internationally with, you know, honoring different frameworks. So yeah, there is a parallel when you start to play with things like that. You start to destroy systems that once upon a time did work. So yeah, and again, it really does come back to just what we honor and how we a food system. A food system that has different values that underpin it. Because with market climate, you know, with capitalism, you know, we try and get money out of it.
Because I was watching this doco about Tanzania and how they were bringing in the GMO seeds to replace original seeds, and then they're forcing, and this sort of tacks into this too, doesn't it? with like, you know, the company seeds as opposed to original seeds that you have?
Yeah, look, that's a whole different discussion. And I've been in some, you know, food system dialogues talks where that's taking its own lens. And it's not something that we're going to get away with. But I do think that something else that has come up, and you just prompted me, that the tech conversation, because part of us signing up to these sustainable development goals, zero hunger and working on everything else, it actually requires a level of investment in tech to aid that. And so that's part of the complications with this. Like, as an example of that is the reducing of methane emissions and farmers having to adopt and invest in tech to sort of aid with that. Well, that's a substantial cost. And if we're not investing in that as an, you know, and we've made it become independent and privatized, and people are up to their own devices on how they manage that. Yeah, where do you think that cost is going to be offset? You know, and so, yeah, I think all of that, absolutely, tech feeds into this. Yeah, for sure.
I guess just thinking ahead, kind of like, and obviously talking about that, kind of trying to shift that conversation from food insecurity to food security, but obviously with things like what will likely within our lifetime be drastic shifts within our climates. Obviously the idea of like what kind of role does kind of food security have in terms of whether it's climate mitigation or climate adaptation kind of strategies? Because I see, like, obviously building on the idea of that, part of the issue within food insecurity is our duopolies, but it's also like our supply lines. How does that then factor in, obviously, then but obviously you mentioned extreme weather events like pandemic
and accurate data collection.
The pandemic, like, obviously when was relatively recently, where like a whole bunch of chickens got bird flu, and it's that sort of thing. There's this massive cull of chickens that are sort of thing. How does food insecurity kind of like, and obviously with these things, likely as our climate shifts, as weather patterns get more unpredictable, as things kind of change, as things that have facilitated our food production systems as flawed as they are, how does that kind of factor into conversations around food security? Like, obviously there's a lot of it focusing on like, here's what the immediate thing people are feeling, but also like, what's that kind of future view, that longer term view around food security?
Yeah, no, for
in the
sure.
broader context of probably what's the changes that are coming.
Yeah, so I think what I kind of immediately thought of is where food sits into our GDP. And so we know that, you know, in terms of our country's income, agriculture makes a massive part of that. And it's, the question creates another question, is how do we then sustain what potentially threatens our environment? So, you know, that people are talking about that. We don't always have the solutions straight away, but absolutely food security fits into that narrative. Because if we want to, you know, it's about creating regenerative systems that are sustainable, you know, and that has always been the goal. And so, yeah, I think we have to absolutely, while we are mindful of the environmental conversation, it comes at an expense of land, of how we use that, how we grow, and yeah, they absolutely will impact on our levels of food insecurity, what we can sustain here. And important questions that open more questions. Yeah,
I think, you know, winding it up, because we've only got probably about a couple of minutes left. I think this is worth another conversation with some more people in the room and bringing their experiences in. You know, I know my experiences as Afro-Kiwi, so, you know, I know like it can be tough out here. I'm watching like a lot of people like not getting access to work, and that creates food insecurity as well. Because how do you get food and where do you go? And I'd like to have you back again. Would you like to come in again for another conversation down the track?
Yeah, look, I'm a hopeful advocate, and I say that I'm hopeful because I know that food insecurity here is not because of scarcity. So for me, that's a really, really good starting point. Yeah. There's other parts of the world where they just don't actually have enough to make it all go round. But we don't have that problem here. And so, I think kind of speaking on the social justice aspect of it, bringing in those threads like cost of living,
Cost of
like
living.
environmentalism, like how do we build capability and sustainability?
Mm.
How do we make people know how to go back to systems that once worked? You know, so having those wider conversations would be great, and it's ongoing.
Yeah.
We talk about food security being a journey and not necessarily the race. We're not
Yeah.
going to get there, you know, tomorrow, but
No.
we'll continue on this journey. So yeah, let's
But
have another conversation.
I'm still looking for my billionaire with one foot in the grave, because like I'll take that house and the land, honey. Is that us?
I hear you.
No, I was
sister.
going to say, yeah, thank you so much for coming in. Like, it had some really interesting conversation. That definitely something I think we need to talk more about. And I think it's just probably just with the current where we're sitting in New Zealand currently. I think it's really
$20 for 4 chops. Like, what's that about?
But yeah, no, and so
Yeah, from an agricultural based nation and from a nation that actually does do a lot of production of food, there's absolutely capacity where we can make this situation better, and I'm ever hopeful about that.
Right,
Cool.
no, so thank you so much. Make sure to check out the Living Collage down at Oddlands Plaza.
Yep, still going on, I
Yeah,
believe.
still going on, and we'll see you guys next time. This has been the Black
Oh,
House.
next week is Cuba Duper.
Next weekend's Cuba Duba. Right, this has been the Black House 106.1 FM. We'll catch everybody next time. Peace.
Thank you.